Thank you everybody for coming tonight to listen. Kapukubil, that means good evening in my language. Kalalagao ya. Kaimeso, Barry, for welcome to country. I pay respects to Wajak Noongar people and all the elders past and present. I want to begin here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my 10 minutes to just give you a longer history to the Uluru Statement from the Heart and a more contemporary history to the Uluru Statement, so you understand precisely where this proposal for a voice comes from, how you come to have this opportunity as Australians to cast a vote later this year to decide to finally give us that voice and to recognise us in the Constitution. I'd like to begin here. This map should be familiar to all of you by now, I think. It shows hundreds of First Nations that were here before colonisation and continue to be very much in existence on this great continent. But this also represents hundreds of unique First Nations languages, is the point that I want to get to here. Because for these unique First Nations languages to evolve on this common continent, so close to each other, we must have been masters of dispute resolution. So if these languages evolved like this, masters of dispute resolution, there is a word that I want you to listen for at the end of this event when I recite the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and that is makarata. And makarata is a Yolngu word for, as the Uluru Statement describes it, the coming together after a struggle. It's a dispute resolution process. And so we would have had a similar language name, you know, for a similar process right across this continent to understand how to make peace. We knew how to make peace, and that's what this is ultimately about. And it's not working. Can I go to the next slide, please? So, colonisation came to our shores. The colonies are now the states, Western Australia, New South Wales, Queensland, etc. And at the end of the 20th century, they negotiated in constitutional dialogues the terms for federating. And so the Constitution, when it came to be, had this section in it. It also had a section that excluded Aboriginal or Indigenous people from being counted as Australian citizens in the census. But this particular section here is section 5126, the race power. And you can see those red words up there. They were removed in the 1967 referendum. But the race power gave the Parliament, the Australian Parliament, the power to make special laws for the people of any race, except the Aboriginal race. And so Aboriginal people in these early days, they campaigned for many decades to remove those red words. It wasn't that the Parliament couldn't make laws for Indigenous people, it's just that that power was with the states. And so Indigenous people saw it as an incremental step forward, an improvement, to campaign to see the federal Parliament have that power. And that was important because the states were particularly cruel and negligent to Indigenous people in those days. So they saw the federal Parliament as a more benevolent Parliament, an opportunity to also move things as a federation to improve things holistically and step by step. Those, before we go on, those red words were removed in 1967. It gave the power to the federal Parliament to make special laws about Indigenous people. And this is important to consider because one of the things that the No campaign is saying is that in 1967 race was taken out of our constitution, that we have a constitution that doesn't talk about race. Well, no. Only those red words were removed, and that special power has been used to make laws about Indigenous people specifically. And in the 1990s there was a Hindmarsh case which determined that that special power could be used not necessarily for the benefit of Indigenous people, but they could use it to our detriment. Next one, please. So we The Uluru Statement from the Heart is one of many statements and petitions. And I'm just going to talk about several here. And you'll see this pattern throughout history that informs us in the Uluru Statement. In 1930s, there was William Cooper and the leaders of the time made a petition to the King. Next one, please. In 1963, the Yirrkala Bark petitions, the Yolngu people seeking to protect country. The Federal Parliament was moving to excise a massive portion of their land for a mine. Next one, please. 1972 was the Larrakia petition to the Queen. And you can see the thumbprints there, the marks from our illiterate elders. All of these statements and petitions have two things in common that I want you to know. They were all dismissed and ignored by the King or Queen or Parliament that they were addressed to. And they also all called for a voice, political representation, the simple means for us to be able to coherently put our positions forward about how we could be better treated, how we could improve our lives. Next one, please. The 1988 Barunga Statement I separate out because Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister at the time, a bit different. He travelled to Barunga, a small Aboriginal community near Katherine in the Northern Territory. And the Barunga Statement again called for a voice. And Hawke promised that voice. He also promised a national treaty, which was called for in the previous one that I mentioned, the Larrakia petition. But he failed to deliver on the treaty, but he did deliver on the voice. And this leads us to another pattern throughout history. Next one, please. So, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission was established under Hawke. And like all those ones above it on that page, it was eventually silenced. Those earlier ones, the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association, the Australian Aborigines League, they were established without waiting for a government to support the establishment of a voice. They established them by their own means and with allies. But you see, the authorities had complete control over our lives, and they used those powers to silence these voices, tactics of intimidation. They could steal our children legally, direct us to work without pay, exile us from country and our families, decide who we could marry. All of these powers were used to silence those voices. And the ones further down, established by more benevolent governments, but always silenced by the next. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission was established under Hawke to the vehement opposition of Howard, who was the opposition leader at the time. And when Howard became the Prime Minister, he took away a massive portion of the budget of ATSIC. And you've got to think about this. Our people were just working hard to lift ourselves out of poverty, right? In the 70s, you still had these really discriminatory laws. We had no chance to build generational wealth. And so ATSIC was a service provider. And when that budget was cut in that way, our people started to fight over what was left. It was a tactic of divide and conquer somewhat. And also, ATSIC was doing some great work. But you see, the government chose to amplify those problems, and it didn't celebrate the good work that ATSIC was doing. A review was done into ATSIC. Two conservative, one former, I think he was a former Attorney General, and Auntie Jackie Huggins from Queensland. This review didn't recommend the shutting down of ATSIC, it recommended that it needed to continue. It was important, but it needed some reform. Now you see, all organisations have problems from time to time, but you change the rules, the constitution to improve those organisations, you deal with the problems. If there are people that are breaking the law, then the law needs to deal with it. But ATSIC, like all of these other voices that we've established, never had the opportunity. 2005, with the support of the Latham Labor opposition, it was crossed out, simple majority in Parliament, a stroke of a pen silenced that voice. Now what happens when we don't have a voice? Next one, please. I mean, that's a great lesson here. That arrow, this is from the book Kerry and I wrote, Kathy Wilcox, great political cartoonist. That arrow always points back down to hostile at some stage. We need to learn that lesson from the history of our struggle. Next one, please. So when you don't have a voice, next one, thank you, you're easily exploited and ignored. We saw the Northern Territory intervention soon after ATSIC was destroyed. Prime Minister basically announcing to the country that those social issues in those communities that suffered poverty, suffered from failed policies over a very long time, all of the traumas carried on from genocide and forced assimilation and stolen generations, basically announced to the country that these were Aboriginal problems that deserved the Racial Discrimination Act being suspended to do it. The Australian Army was rolled in against those most vulnerable communities, and we know today that for hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, all it did was make things worse. It was an intervention. It was done without Indigenous people, and it failed. Next one, please. We saw massive budget cuts, 534 million cut under Abbott, and we saw the gap continue to widen. So in this crisis, next one please, next one. In this crisis, 39 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders called for a meeting with the Prime Minister and opposition leader. They said that we need to take this question about what form of constitutional recognition we could accept to the communities and to the Australian people, and that's where the Referendum Council came from. They conducted these dialogues across the country. We held the National Constitutional Convention. That's all right, keep going. I'm probably taking too long. The National Constitutional Convention was held after 13 regional dialogues, 100 participants each, not to exclude anybody, but to ensure there was a cross-section of perspectives and experiences, not just the loudest of our people, but the healers, the quieter advocates, so they could be heard. We came together and we came to this wonderful moment on the third and final morning at Uluru when we endorsed the Uluru Statement from the Heart with standing acclamation and tears of joy and hope. Next one, please. And so that is where this proposition of a voice comes from. We learnt that if those other statements and petitions were ignored, then we need to write this one to the Australian people, to you. That if all of our other voices have been silenced, then we need to do something different and enshrine it in the Constitution so it's the will of the Australian people that says that Indigenous people should be listened to. And lastly, we know we need a voice, because when you don't have a voice, all of those awful things happen without hardly any defence against it. But a voice is also going to be important to doing more positive things, and Fiona is going to talk about the evidence there. Next one, please. Next. So, look, I'll wrap up here. We were well informed. We understand that we need this voice. And when it was rejected, the Uluru Statement from the Heart back in 2017, we didn't take no for an answer. We took this to the Australian people and we convinced the present government to commit to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. And that is why we are going to a referendum later this year. It is not Albo's idea. It's not a Canberra voice. This has sound logic and the backing of history that says that we should vote yes. And I hope you do. Thank you.